He conquered half the known world before the age of 32. No army could stop him, no empire could outlast him. But in the end, it wasn't a sword or a spear that brought Alexander the Great down. What killed him is a mystery that haunts history to this very day.
History is not just written, it is forged.
The year is 323 BC. Dust rises over the ancient roads of Persia as a great army marches westward, exhausted, battle-scarred, and quietly mourning a war that never truly ended. At the front rides Alexander III of Macedon. His eyes are tired, his body is worn, yet his legend is anything but. He has crossed deserts, climbed mountains, and shattered empires. But now, for the first time in his life, Alexander is heading back and no one knows what comes next. Think about what this man had accomplished. By 32, Alexander controlled more land than any ruler before him. From the Greek cities of Macedonia to the burning plains of India, his empire stretched over 2 million square miles. He had defeated the Persian Empire, the greatest military power of the age. He had marched where no Greek had ever dared, and he had done it all not by luck but by sheer, terrifying, unstoppable will. Yet even gods bleed. Before we talk about Alexander's death, we have to talk about Hephaestion, because Hephaestion wasn't just a general. He wasn't just a friend. He was the one person Alexander trusted above all others, the soul of the king, some said. In the autumn of 324 BC, Hephaestion fell gravely ill in the city of Ecbatana. A fever took him quickly, without warning. When a messenger reached Alexander with the news, something inside the great conqueror broke, and it never fully healed. Alexander's reaction to Hephaestion's death shocked everyone who witnessed it. He threw himself onto the body and wept for hours. He refused to eat his generals. For days, he lay beside his fallen companion in silence. Ancient historians describe Alexander's grief as something beyond mourning, something that bordered on madness. He ordered the sacred flame of the temple of Asclepius extinguished as punishment to the god who did not save the man he loved most. Alexander ordered the most extravagant funeral the ancient world had ever seen. He spent over 10,000 talents of fortune beyond imagination on Hephaestion's funeral pyre. Lions and eagles were carved into towering monuments. Entire cities were ordered to observe mourning. He requested that Hephaestion be honored as a divine hero. Every act was excessive, deliberate, almost desperate, as if by honoring him grandly enough, Alexander could will his friend back into existence. But grief doesn't work that way, it only deepens. Strange things were being reported around Alexander. The ancient world believed deeply in omens, signs from the gods that warned of what was coming, and the signs around Alexander were darkening. In Babylon, priests of the god Bel told his advisors that the king should not enter the city from the west, a direction they associated with death. Ravens began fighting each other in the sky above his camp, falling dead at his feet. Even his horse, Bucephalus, had recently died. The gods were speaking. Despite every warning, Alexander marched toward Babylon. For him, omens were challenges, not commands. He was a man who had been declared a son of Zeus, a god-king by the priests of Egypt. What a superstition. Babylon was to be his new capital, the center of the greatest empire the world had ever seen. He had plans, a fleet to sail around Arabia, new cities to build, new worlds to conquer. Babylon was not a destination, it was a big. The Chaldean priests of Babylon were among the most respected astronomers and oracles of the ancient world. When Alexander's advanced scouts reached the city, the priests met them with an urgent message. Do not let the king enter Babylon from the west. Redirect him, take him around. The priests were insistent. They believed their calculations pointed to disaster if the king entered as planned. Alexander's advisors were rattled. They urged the king to listen. For once he hesitated. Alexander attempted to enter Babylon from the east as the priests suggested, but the marshy ground made it nearly impossible, forcing his army to loop back. To Alexander, this was a sign of its own. The gods were not guiding him away. The terrain itself was simply difficult. He entered Babylon from the west just as the priests had feared. His generals exchanged worried glances. His officers whispered among themselves. But Alexander walked in with his head high, as he always had. In Babylon, Alexander threw himself into planning. He met with admirals about the Arabian expedition. He reviewed architectural plans for new temples and harbors. He received ambassadors from across the world, from Greece, from Africa, from Italy. His energy seemed restored. The grief of Hephaestion's death was not gone, but ambition was covering it. Then, in late May of 323 BC, Alexander attended a banquet at the home of his Macedonian officer, Medius of Larissa. He did not know it would be his last night stand. The banquet was lavish, loud, and long. Ancient sources tell us Alexander drank heavily that night, as he often did. In the Macedonian court, drinking was both a social ritual and a test of manhood. Kings drank with their generals. Generals drank with their soldiers. Wine was everywhere. But that night, something felt different to those watching closely. At one point, Alexander reportedly cried out as if struck by sudden sharp pain like an arrow through the back. He continued drinking. He always continued. Ancient accounts tell us that Alexander lifted a large cup, the bowl of Heracles, it was called, and drained it in a single long drink. He toasted to the gods, to his empire, to the men who had marched with him across the world. The room roared with approval, but then his expression changed. He grew quiet. Some historians describe him grimacing, pressing a hand to his side. His companions assumed it was the wine. Nobody thought to worry. Nobody yet knew this was the beginning of the end. The next morning, Alexander was feverish. His attendants noted that he struggled to rise, that his skin was burning, that his eyes had lost some of their usual sharp intensity. They assumed it was a hangover. Alexander's drinking bouts were famous and had left him bedridden before. He was helped to the baths, which was a common remedy. He then made his way to make sacrifices to the gods, as was his daily ritual. But he was slower, heavier. The fire inside him was changing. By the second day, the fever had not broken. Alexander was carried to the palace pools to rest in the cool water, another old remedy. He still managed to hold a meeting with his senior generals, going over plans for the Arabian campaign. He refused to cancel, he refused to slow down. That was Alexander, a man incapable of stillness. But those who stood close to him noticed how hard he was working simply to speak, to focus, to appear as he always had, strong, certain. By the fourth day, Alexander could no longer walk unaided. The fever had climbed. He was burning from within. His generals and companions tried to keep calm, but fear was spreading through the palace like smoke through a closed room. Alexander was moved to the royal gardens, where he could rest beside the river. The fresh air, his physicians hoped, might help. It did not. He continued giving orders from his sickbed, directing his officers on assignments, refusing to let the empire feel that its king was failing. Word spread through the army camp. The king was ill, and not mildly ill. The men who had marched with Alexander across the world gathered outside the palace walls. These were soldiers who had survived the Battle of Gaugamela, the siege of Tyre, the brutal campaign through India. They had followed this man through rivers, deserts, and blizzards. They had believed him untouchable, semi-divine even. Now they stood in uncertain silence, whispering prayers to gods they hoped were still listening. The camp was eerily quiet. When the soldiers heard that Alexander might be dying, the reaction was not calm. They demanded to see him. His officers tried to hold them back. The king needed rest, they said. But these men were beyond reason. They had given everything for Alexander. They needed to see his face, to confirm he still lived, to believe that their world was not about to collapse. Eventually, Alexander ordered the doors opened. The soldiers filed past his bed in silence. He raised his hand to each man. By the 9th day of his illness, Alexander could no longer speak. He had lost his voice entirely. He could only look. His eyes, those famous mismatched eyes, one dark and one light, were still alert, still present. As each of his generals and companions passed before him, he lifted his head slightly or moved his hand as a greeting. Ancient sources describe the scene as heartbreaking. Men who had never wept in battle wept openly in that room. The king was still there. Even before Alexander drew his last breath, people were whispering the word poison. In the ancient world, poison was the weapon of cowards and conspirators, and Alexander had made many enemies. His own generals feared his growing ambition. His forced adoption of Persian customs had angered many Macedonians. His execution of officers he suspected of disloyalty had created quiet resentment. When a powerful man dies young, and suddenly, the question is always the same: who benefits? And in Alexander's case, the answer was almost everyone around. Let's think about this carefully. Alexander had spent years centralizing power, removing anyone who challenged him. He had executed Philotas and his own father Parmenion on suspicion of treason. He had killed his closest companion Claudius in a drunken rage, a moment he regretted deeply, but could never undo. He had alienated Greek traditionalists by bowing to Persian gods. The men closest to him had the most to gain from a succession and the most to lose if Alexander lived long enough to turn on them. Ancient historians pointed fingers at several people. Antipater, Alexander's regent in Macedonia, was one. Alexander had reportedly been planning to replace him and may have been on the verge of ordering his arrest. Antipater's son Cassander had recently visited Babylon and had openly clashed with Alexander in court. Aristotle, Alexander's childhood tutor, was also mentioned, bizarrely, though with little real evidence. Then there was Roxana, Alexander's wife, who had her own fierce ambitions for the child she was carrying. The list of suspects was longer than anyone admitted. Of all the suspects, Cassander stands out most to modern historians. He arrived in Babylon shortly before Alexander's illness. By ancient accounts, he and Alexander had a violent confrontation. Alexander grabbed Cassander by the hair and struck him against a wall over his behavior. Cassander reportedly laughed at Macedonians who bowed in the Persian style, which enraged Alexander. The hatred between them was real and documented. Murder Alexander's son, his wife, and even his mother. Alexander's son, his wife, and even his mother. A man willing to do all of that was capable of anything. The strangest thread in the poison theory leads back to Aristotle, Alexander's own teacher. Ancient writers claim that it was Aristotle who provided the poison, and that Cassander, Aristotle's acquaintance, was the one who brought it to Babylon. The substance, they said, was collected from a river in Nonacris, a water so cold and corrosive it could only be stored in a mule's hoof without dissolving the container. It sounds like legend, but it's been written about seriously enough that historians still debate it 2,000 years later. So how credible is the poison theory? Ancient sources including Plutarch, Arrian, and Diodorus all mention it, though none fully endorse it. The story appears to have gained momentum in the years following Alexander's death, especially as Cassander rose to power and systematically eliminated Alexander's family. Some historians believe the poison story was fabricated by Alexander's supporters as propaganda against Cassander. Others believe it was suppressed by Cassander's regime for obvious reasons. Like so much of ancient history, the truth lies somewhere in the smoke between two fires. In recent decades, scientists and medical researchers have revisited Alexander's death with new tools. Toxicologists have studied the ancient descriptions of his symptoms: the fever, the sharp pain, the gradual loss of voice and movement, the long duration of illness before death. Their conclusion? The symptom profile doesn't match most ancient poisons well. Poisons of that era tended to work faster or produced very different symptoms. The evidence, they argue, points away from murder and towards something else entirely, something biological, something invisible, something modern medicine recognized. The leading scientific theory today is that Alexander died from typhoid fever, likely complicated by other infections. Babylon was a densely populated city built along the Euphrates River. Contaminated water was common. Typhoid was endemic to the region. The symptoms: high fever, progressive weakness, loss of voice, abdominal pain, slow decline over days match Alexander's described illness almost perfectly. Some researchers believe he may have also contracted a secondary bacterial infection in his lungs. It would explain the timeline. It would explain the suffering. It is not glamorous, but it is likely true. Some historians argue that Alexander's body was already compromised long before the banquet of Medius. Years of heavy drinking had taken a serious toll on his liver. Multiple battle wounds, including a near-fatal arrow to the lung in India, had left his body damaged and less able to fight infection. And then there was grief. The death of Hephaestion had shattered something in Alexander emotionally. His sleep was disturbed, his appetite was poor, his drinking had increased. A weakened body, an open wound in the soul, and then a fever. The timing was devastating. One of the most haunting details in Alexander's final days involves his signet ring. As he lost consciousness, he allegedly removed his royal ring, the ring bearing the seal of his authority, and gave it to Perdiccas, one of his generals. It was an act of transfer, of letting go. In the ancient world, the ring was power itself. To give it away was to acknowledge that the power was passing on. Alexander, who had never surrendered anything in his life, surrendered his ring without a struggle. Something in him already knew. What were Alexander's last words? This is one of history's most debated questions. The most famous account, recorded centuries later, claims his generals asked who should inherit his vast empire. His answer reportedly was, "To the strongest." 3 words that would ignite 50 years of war among his successors. However, many modern historians believe this account is fictional, constructed after the fact to explain the chaos that followed. A more sober account says Alexander had already lost the ability to speak by the time of his death. In his final hours, Alexander lay still. The great general who had commanded hundreds of thousands, who had stood on the bow of ships in Persian waters and shouted orders across battlefield smoke, was silent. His breathing was shallow. His famous energy, that crackling, almost supernatural force that his men said they could feel when he entered a room, was gone. The physicians stood helpless, his companions sat inside the palace walls, an army waited, and history held its breath for the last time. As Alexander's condition became clearly hopeless, his senior generals Perdiccas, Ptolemy, Seleucus, Lysimachus gathered at his bedside. They needed to know who would follow him. Alexander had no clear heir. His wife Roxana was pregnant, but the child had not yet been born. He had not formally named a successor. His empire, the largest ever assembled, had no plan for the day after. The generals asked their question one last time to a man who could barely hear them and could not answer. Whether Alexander truly said it or not, to the strongest became the legacy of his final moment. It was a warrior's answer fitting for a warrior's life, and in a tragic way it was accurate. The men who fought hardest after his death were the ones who carved the empire apart. His generals, the Diadochi, the successors, would spend the next 40 years destroying each other over the territory Alexander had bled to build. In his silence, Alexander may have understood something about human nature that none of his campaigns could conquer. Power is never simply passed on, it is always taken. Here is a detail that has mystified historians for centuries. After Alexander died on June 11, 323 BC, his body reportedly showed no signs of decay for 6 full days. In a hot Babylonian summer, in an age before embalming, this was extraordinary. His attendants reportedly believed he was not truly dead, that he lay in a divine sleep. Some modern medical researchers have proposed a startling alternative explanation. Alexander may not have been dead at all. He may have been suffering from Guillain-Barré syndrome, a condition that mimics death through total paralysis. To the people who witnessed it, the preservation of Alexander's body was proof of his divinity. The son of Zeus did not rot like ordinary men. The gods themselves were honoring him in death as they had honored him in life. Priests declared it miraculous. Soldiers wept and prayed. In a world where religion and power were inseparable, this detail mattered enormously. It added mythology to a man who was already legend. Whether divine or medical, the result was the same. Alexander left the world as he had lived in it, larger than life. The moment Alexander died, the empire he had built began to tear itself apart. His generals wasted no time. Within hours, the argument started. Who held authority? Who spoke for the army? Who controlled Babylon? Perdiccas claimed regency based on the ring. Others disputed it. Meleager, an infantry commander, backed the claim of Philip Arrhidaeus, Alexander's half-brother, a man with limited mental capacity. Soldiers divided between factions. Chaos moved through the palace like the fever that had just claimed its king. The empire had no center anymore. It was already within a decade of Alexander's death, his vast empire had been carved into several kingdoms. Egypt went to Ptolemy, who would found a dynasty lasting nearly 300 years. Seleucus took Persia and the East, building what became the largest of the successor states. Antigonus controlled much of Asia Minor and Greece. Cassander seized Macedonia, the very homeland Alexander had left behind. Each of these men had served under Alexander. Each had learned conquest from him. Now they used those lessons against each other in wars that would reshape the ancient world completely. Roxana gave birth to a boy shortly after Alexander's death. He was named Alexander IV. On paper, he was the rightful heir to the greatest empire on earth. In reality, he was a political pawn in a dangerous game he had no power to play. He spent his early years as a figurehead, moved from city to city under the protection of one general after another. Then, around 309 BC, Cassander had the boy killed quietly, without ceremony, without a public announcement. The last bloodline of Alexander the Great ended in silence. Roxana, Alexander's Bactrian wife, was a woman of fierce intelligence and cold political instinct. The moment Alexander died, she had his other wife, Statera, the Persian princess, summoned and killed. She was protecting her unborn child's claim to power. Roxana understood the game of succession with terrifying clarity. She allied with Olympias, Alexander's mother, and fought to keep her son's claim alive for years. But she could not fight Cassander forever. In the end, she too was captured and killed. Her story is one of the most tragic in the aftermath of Alexander's death. Olympias, Alexander's mother, was perhaps the most formidable woman of the ancient world. Brilliant, ruthless, and utterly devoted to her son's legacy, she fought viciously to protect Alexander IV's claim to the throne after Alexander's death. She returned to Macedonia, had Philip Arrhidaeus and his wife killed, and seized power. But Cassander marched against her, and even her legendary reputation could not hold back an army. She was captured. Her enemies demanded execution. Even in her final moments, witnesses say she walked to her death as a queen. She refused to bend. So what did Alexander actually leave behind? Yes, the empire fell apart. Yes, his family was destroyed. Yes, the chaos he unleashed by not naming a successor caused decades of devastating war. But something else survived, something more powerful than any boundary on a map. Alexander spread Greek language, Greek art, Greek philosophy, and Greek ideas across 3 continents. The world he created, a blended, interconnected, multicultural ancient world, is called the Hellenistic Age. It lasted for 3 centuries. It changed how human beings thought, traded, worshipped, and governed. That does not fall apart. One of the most remarkable things Alexander did was build cities. Everywhere he conquered, he founded new cities and named them after himself. Historians have counted over 20 cities named Alexandria. The most famous, of course, is Alexandria in Egypt, which became the greatest city in the ancient world, home to the legendary Library of Alexandria, the center of learning for the Mediterranean. These cities weren't just military outposts. They were living experiments in cultural fusion. Greek settlers, local populations, shared markets, shared ideas. They became centers of civilization that outlasted Alexander by centuries. Because of Alexander, Greek became the common language of the ancient world, what Latin would later become in the West, what English is today globally. The New Testament of the Bible was written in Greek because of Alexander's conquests. The philosophies of Aristotle, Plato, and Stoicism spread across Persia, Egypt, and India. Scientists in Alexandria mapped the earth and calculated its circumference. Artists blended Greek and Eastern styles into something entirely new. Alexander didn't just conquer land, he rewired the cultural DNA of 3 continents, and the effects are still felt today. This question has divided historians for centuries, and it deserves a real answer. The greatness is undeniable in military terms. No general in history matched his combination of speed, adaptability, and personal courage. But Alexander also destroyed cities, massacred populations, and burned Persepolis, the greatest palace in the Persian world, reportedly in a drunken rage. He executed men who questioned him. He demanded to be worshipped as a god. He was visionary and brutal, brilliant and broken. History rarely gives us simple heroes, and Alexander perhaps more than anyone proves that. Beneath the legend was a man haunted by the pressure of being Alexander the Great. He had been told since childhood that he was the son of Zeus, destined for greatness. His mother Olympias had filled his head with myth and prophecy. His father Philip had trained him to conquer the world and made it clear that anything less was failure. Alexander spent his entire life running towards something he could never quite reach. He conquered everything around him, but some part of him always felt like it wasn't enough. That hunger never stopped, even at the end. For centuries, histories of Alexander were written by the victors, by the successors who shaped his legacy to suit their own power. The real Alexander, flawed, brilliant, impulsive, and deeply human, was buried under layers of myth. We have no writings from Alexander himself. We have no first-hand accounts from soldiers who marched beside him. What we have are reconstructions written centuries after the fact, filtered through political agendas. The truth is that we know both more and less about Alexander than we think, and that uncertainty is itself part of his mystery. Here is one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. Where is Alexander's tomb? His body was initially taken to Memphis in Egypt and later moved to Alexandria by Ptolemy, who understood that possessing Alexander's body was its own form of political power. A magnificent tomb was built in Alexandria. Ancient writers described visiting it. Julius Caesar stood before it and wept. Augustus visited and accidentally knocked the nose off the mummified body. And then somewhere around the 3rd or 4th century AD, the tomb disappeared. No one knows where it is today. Dozens of theories have been proposed. Some believe the tomb is still somewhere beneath the modern city of Alexandria in Egypt, buried under centuries of urban development and the rising sea level. Others suggest it was moved to Macedonia, back to his homeland. A Greek archaeologist once claimed a tomb discovered at Amphipolis was Alexander's, though the theory was later disputed. The search continues. Archaeologists, historians, and explorers still pursue it. Finding Alexander's tomb would be one of the greatest archaeological discoveries in human history. The king is still out there somewhere. Every few years, a new claim emerges, a new excavation, a new theory. A researcher in Egypt announces a breakthrough. A satellite imaging project identifies an anomaly under the streets of Alexandria. The world pays attention for a moment, and then the evidence proves inconclusive, and the tomb retreats back into myth. But the searching itself says something profound about human nature. We are drawn to Alexander not just as a historical figure, but as something more. A symbol of what it means to push beyond every boundary that was ever set. We want to find him. We're not ready to let 2,300 years have passed since Alexander the Great drew his last breath in Babylon. And yet here we are still talking about him. Still debating how he died, what he meant, whether he was good or evil, hero or tyrant. That endurance is itself a form of greatness. He matters because he represents something eternal in the human spirit, the refusal to accept limits. He looked at the world and said, "I will not stop here." And even death, the one boundary no one crosses, could not fully silence him. Alexander the Great died at 32. He left behind no heir who survived, no stable empire, no written words, and no tomb we can find. And yet he changed the world more completely than almost any human being in history. His story is a meditation on ambition, grief, power, mortality, and the terrifying cost of greatness. What do you think, was Alexander truly great, or was his legacy built on destruction? Drop your answer in the comments, and if this story moved you, share it. History deserves to be heard.